Hey everybody, and welcome to part 4 of how to paint graphic cities in Photoshop. Today is the day we are actually finally going to paint this reference image here together, and we're going to use everything that we've learned so far from part 1 of the series all the way to now. So we've learned how to use the lasso tool, we've learned how to use clipping masks, and in the last video we also learned how to use smart objects and custom shapes. Now is actually the time that we're going to blend all of these skills together and paint something. Now, I do want to get a couple of housekeeping things first out of the way. While we have gone and looked at a lot of the different tools to use in Photoshop, I've not talked about anything with perspective or color or lighting, any of the fundamentals really. The aim of this series is to get you used to using these tools so that you can implement them in your paintings. But this video here is going to assume that you have a little bit of knowledge of environments to begin with. But don't worry, because I am going to be explaining every single thing that I'm doing in this video. I don't want it to be like a paint by numbers sort of thing where you're copying exactly what I'm doing, but instead my main goal is to help you to think critically and give you the tool sets to accomplish whatever visual problems you have when you paint. In addition to today's video, I'm also going to be adding on my Gumroad a bunch of different goodies, such as the reference image we're going to paint today, a perspective grid you can use and bring into your own Photoshop file, and just like the work in progress shots of me painting this thing. Separately, I'm also going to be adding the actual Photoshop file that you can buy, and you can just go through and have a look at my layers to see how I've managed things, to how I've blocked certain things out, and then you can use that for your own learning too. Oh yeah, one more thing before we begin, I did forget to add a couple of worksheets for part 3, so I've gone ahead and added those on my Gumroad, and you can just use them to practice creating smart objects and custom shapes. Anyway, let's get straight into it. Okay, let's just spend a couple of minutes analyzing this image here before we go to paint it. I know we did a little bit in part 4, but I want to take it a step further here. So if we just have a look and think about how we're going to start painting this. The reason I chose this specific image is because this front building here is very, very visually interesting to look at. You know, it has bricks, it has windows, it's got graffiti, it also has all of these interesting pipes that are sort of strewn about everywhere, but it's very flat in perspective. So it makes it a lot easier for us to paint this thing, and if we just go ahead and analyze the rest of it, we've got a concrete wall that's not much texture, not as detailed as that front building there, but there are a couple of lines here that kind of indicate that perspective, and it's going to help us use the transform tool in Photoshop to achieve that effect. In the background, we do also have more of a residential building, so there's a lot of glass panels here, and again it's very, very flat and it sits behind this brick building here, but this should be nice and straightforward to create. The one that's going to give us the most challenge is definitely going to be this building on this side, because it is in perspective. There's a lot of detail, there's windowsills, bricks, pipes again, and there's a lot of extra elements and just visual noise. So I'm specifically going to slow down when I'm painting this section here and show you what I'm doing to achieve that look. Secondly, I've not even touched upon this at all, but when it comes to perspective, so if we just have a look at this image, there's a converging line here, here, and here. So the horizon line is somewhere about here-ish in this image. This car on this side here is not going to be vanishing to this horizon line. The reason why is because this bit of the road right here is not completely straight. It's on a bit of an incline like this. So just keep that in mind when you are painting this scene. I am going to create a perspective grid for you to use, and I'll upload that on my Gumroad as well for you to check out. But if you want to go ahead and create your own perspective grid, just keep that in mind. I will also link a video to Orenji art in the description down below, where he shows you how to make a very, very fast and simple perspective grid in Photoshop if you want to use that too. Now that I've got my illustration here, I don't want you to spend too much time trying to make it exactly accurate to the reference. You don't have to have every single brick to be the same. You don't even have to have a lot of the perspective to be exactly the same. The main thing I want you to focus on is to think about the actual process of creating this piece. So think about the problem-solving skills you have to create those windows, to create those bricks, warp it in perspective. The point of this exercise isn't to have something super sexy to post on Instagram later, but it's really just about getting you in the mindset of thinking about how to deconstruct urban references and then paint them and recreate them in Photoshop, or whichever painting software you choose. So the very first thing that I'm doing here is just creating a perspective grid based off of my reference. I am keeping it 1-to-1 just because I don't really want to think about the perspective too much. I've created this grid using a plugin called Perspective Tools V2, which I highly recommend, and I'll link it in the description below. And I've gone ahead and just traced very loosely where all of the different building shapes are. So you can see that I'm creating different layers and I'm keeping all of these buildings separated, just because when we do go to use clipping masks later on, it's going to make everything nice and clean. At this stage, when I'm thinking about colors, I'm really thinking about the average color that's in a particular shape. So for example, that middle brick building over there, I'm really just thinking about not all of the windows and all of the details, but just that color orange. It's the same for the ground, for the building on the right, and the one in the distance as well. If it's mostly in shadow, the color is going to be darker. If it's mostly lighter, then the first initial color I pick will be lighter, and then I'll add all of the details on top. So at the moment, you can see that I'm using a whole bunch of different tools that we've learned so far in this series, from the lasso tool to the rectangular and elliptical marquee tool, and even the pen tool, just to block in my initial shapes here. Once I've done that, I'm going ahead with the street floor section now. I've locked the transparent pixels, and now I'm just painting in a very just little bits and pieces of initial detail to get me started. Again, in this series, I haven't really spoken anything about texture or different custom brushes and things like that. I do have a separate video on custom brushes that you can check out, but at this stage, I'm really just blocking in little bits and hints of concrete, a little bit of hint of color here and there and things like that. Now I'm starting to use the custom shapes that we learned in the last tutorial. This is that brick texture that I have, and again, it's a very simple and straightforward process. Just creating it, tiling it a bunch of times to fit the scale and the direction of this building, and then merging everything together and using that as the grout. So now that I've got the entire building selected, I'm offsetting it slightly just because in the reference there is a slight indent here where this section is. And using the actual brick layer, I'm also creating a clipping mask on top of that, and it allows me to paint on top of the bricks. The easiest way that I would recommend approaching any building in this style of painting is you have your initial layer here, so the one with the average color. The texture goes over that, and then you'll have bricks on top and then windows on top of that. So just in terms of layer structure and layer management, this is sort of what I'm thinking about. It just makes further edits a lot easy, and you're not sort of fighting everything because you have it all nice and separated. So right now as well, I'm just painting in the windows very quickly. And a good technique to do this is, again, to create a rectangular shape, and then in combination with using the lasso tool and the rectangular marquee tool, painting in all of the window frame dividers, the reflections, blinds or curtains, and things like that as well. And you can see creating windows again is very simple, just starting off with a black rectangle and then duplicating it across, and then I'm starting to paint in some of the bands now on top of it. So it's really also thinking about simplification where you can. I'm staying zoomed out most of the time as well because I don't want to get lost in all of the details. There's a lot to really analyze, but I'm just trying to keep the overall essence of the building here. It should be noted that the painting that you're seeing now took me about 4.5 hours, but when you are attempting this yourself, don't think too much about how long it's going to take you. The main thing here, again, is slowly building up that muscle memory for problem-solving skills. When to use the marquee tool, when to use clipping masks, when to duplicate things. There is no right or wrong answer. It's really what works for you and what yields the best results, so I do encourage a lot of experimentation. And the reason that I'm showing you all of this as well is just to show my process and how I approach certain things when painting this piece. It also really helps thinking and moving in one step at a time. So very much like cooking, you know, there's a recipe or a process to follow, and it can really help to structure your painting sessions. So again, when I am painting different buildings, I'm thinking first about the overall shape of the building and color of the building, then texture on top of that, and then things like bricks, windows, and other tertiary bits and pieces. So you can see right now that I'm starting to paint a lot of the piping here that was on this building, and you'll notice that I started off with just a simple color, just a very, very bright yellow. That's just for me to see how the different angles were looking, and where I wanted to, you know, deviate from the reference, where I wanted to keep things the same. And then I made it orange, and now with a clipping mask, I'm just painting in the little bits and pieces of shadow detail over that. To make it a little bit more Spider-Verse, I am just highlighting and selecting these two windows here, and then using Shift and Alt, I'm just skewing it ever so slightly in perspective. Again, it's not part of the reference, but it is a heavy element in Spider-Verse and Intergalactic as well. And going back to that initial building layer, I am also just painting in a little bit of color variation just to make things a bit more interesting. So you'll notice that there's a little bit more purple at the bottom, there is a little bit more green poking through, and this is why it really helps to have your layers separate, because all of the brick layers and all of the windows on top are separate, they're not being touched by anything. I can go back to that base building layer and change the colors and add more details if I want to as well. At the moment now, I'm working on the left-hand side building. This one was very, very straightforward. It's just a big concrete building with a bunch of lines just to separate floors. And you'll see that I've just painted in some rough texture. And now with these lines, I've drawn them across in Photoshop. I've duplicated it a bunch of times to have 3. And then I've converted it into a smart object, and now I'm sort of warping it in perspective. So again, there's a lot of different ways you could approach it. You can see me now, I'm actually physically drawing these lines by hand. And that's why I sort of encourage experimentation, just to see what works for you, what you like to do, and what doesn't. Now I'm moving on to the back building, and you can see that just creating the windows the exact same way. So starting off with a very, very dark rectangle, and at this stage I'm really thinking about the spacing and the number of windows that I want. So just duplicating things, shifting things around, and I'll have sort of a flat sticker like this, and then moving it down to the secondary building layer. I'm going to warp it in perspective a little bit, create a clipping mask, and then start to paint the actual reflections and get it to a truer color of what I see in the reference. So the reason I create the buildings here, the reason I create the windows very, very dark is just so I can actually see it, physically see it in Photoshop. Again, I'm not thinking about the color at this stage. I'm just thinking about the actual shape and placement of objects. It's also helpful to flip the canvas every now and again just to get a bit of a new perspective on your painting, which is what I'm doing here. Okay, so now I'm working on the right building, and at the beginning of this video I said that this building was going to be the most complicated to tackle. You'll start to see that here because I struggled a couple of times trying to get all of these details correct. The first thing that I'm doing again is starting off with a brick custom shape. I'm throwing it down and I'm trying to warp it in perspective using a smart object. At this stage, I knew that I wanted to, this is a way that I could do it, but you can see I've duplicated that brick here just because the scale wasn't quite lining up. It didn't really look right to me, so instead what I wanted to do was create the entire building front flat, like completely flat with the windows and all of the extra details, and then warp all of it into perspective, so it's less work for me to do. So what you can see here that I'm doing is I've created a rectangle with that beige color, and then I'm going ahead and making the bricks here roughly to what I think the scale is going to be. Again, just using that custom shape. So I'm taking my time, I'm making sure all of the bricks are lining up, making sure that the scale feels somewhat correct, and then I'm going to go ahead and add all of the windows on top of that as well. I'm creating these windows using the exact same methods that we've been doing in this series here. So just the rectangular marquee tool, and then I'll be blocking in the initial shapes and then all of the window frame dividers and extra details and things like that as well. It's also important to note that I'm keeping everything on a separate layer just so that I have a little bit of extra, I can edit those things later on once I've warped it in perspective. You'll start to see later on in this time lapse as well, you'll see that I converted everything into a smart object, and as a result, Photoshop merged all of my layers together. When I did go to rasterize this building texture later on in perspective, it was a lot harder to edit because everything was essentially one layer. What I ended up doing instead was I created each individual layer, so I mean the brick texture, the window texture, the initial beige color as well, as separate smart objects. I put those smart objects into a group and then warped the group. You'll see in the time lapse when I committed those changes, it allowed me to go back and actually individually change all of the different windows and all of the bricks as a separate entity, which makes things a lot handier when you are committing this change in perspective. So this is the part here, if you just pay attention to my layers, I've merged everything as one giant smart object. So all of the windows, all of the bricks and shapes and everything like that. And when I committed the change, it merged all of it into one layer, which is not good. I decided to leave this portion of the time-lapse in just to show that when I am painting as well, I don't have everything figured out completely from the start. I like to experiment and see different solutions to different visual problems that I have, and then this just so happens to be one of them. So after a couple of noodling around, I really wasn't getting the result that I was looking for, so I initially went back to my flat texture that I created, and you can see on the left-hand side that every single element is a separate smart object. Now when I've converted everything into a smart object, I put all of it into a group, and once I commit this change in perspective, I'm retaining all of the different points of editability. So now if you look at me, I'm going through all of my different layers here. I've got the windows, I've got the bricks, and they're all smart objects, so I can still go ahead and shift things around. The reason that I did this is because when I'm creating that flat texture, I don't exactly know how it's going to translate once I've warped it in perspective. So this just sort of gives me a little bit of breathing room to go ahead and make changes with windows, move them down a little bit, scale them in a little bit, rather than having to nail it on the first go. In this section now, because it was a flat texture, we have to paint the depth that's going in perspective as well. So you can see that I'm just using those windows, creating a clipping mask, and then painting in that extra depth of the window frame. I'm also following the brick texture that I've got, and I'm using a pen tool, I'm using a pen brush rather, and actually just drawing in the individual grouts just to complete that look. So you can see already how fast we set up this building face, and now it's just all about painting it as we would anything else. Again, it's about that preparation that you have at the start to make the painting process easier, so you're not actually having to worry too much about the windows that are correctly aligned in perspective, trying to make sure the bricks all look good. It's a very, very easy and fast way to approach something like this. Benefit of also having my windows as a separate layer is I can add the reflections that's in the reference image here from the other building. The way that I'm doing that is I'm actually duplicating that window layer on the brick building and then adding that as a clipping mask onto my other window layer, and I'm just flipping it across here. I adjusted it also using a little bit of levels, making it a bit lighter so it wasn't as dark, and then just sort of integrating it in the window. A big portion when it comes to graphic environments, and especially any kind of cityscape, is reflections. I'm just spending a little bit of extra time color picking the surrounding colors in the other buildings and things like that, and then adding it into this window over here. And I'm also adding these windowsills under the windows as well. The windowsills was something that I didn't create in my flat texture at the beginning, just because I wanted to paint them in by hand and have a little bit more control. The more that you use this technique in your own paintings as well, the easier it sort of becomes to intuitively feel what sort of direction you should be going in. Again, at the end of the day, the decisions that you make in your painting are really up to you, and my hope with these videos is to provide you the tools to start thinking about how you can solve your own visual problems. Now I'm just focusing on the curb side, so again, just a layer on top of everything, just painting in very, very simple shapes here, and then adding in some lighting on top, and then just making sure all of the colors look nice and things like that. So if I had to give some advice for picking colors, it's really thinking about, again, the average color that you're looking at. And it really does help to group things together, because instead of looking at the lighting here and the shadows here, I think of it as just a giant object that isn't being affected by lighting. I'll paint the silhouette in and then very, very quickly block in just the average colors that I see. And at this point in the time lapse, you're going to see me jump around a little bit and just try and work on the image as a whole. But so far, I've kept things very separate, because when you are painting as well, having sort of a checklist, or at least for me, I find that to be a very good way to not get overwhelmed in details. So when I started this painting, just to reiterate, I went with the line sketch first, I blocked in all of the different buildings, I then worked on that brick building in the front, and then a little bit of the floor, and sort of moving by building to building, making sure the details look nice. Once things start coming together and it feels a little bit more cohesive, I'll then look at the entire image as a whole and add details where I see fit. Right now it's quite straightforward. I'm just painting in the aircon unit that you see here. I'm shifting it a little bit in perspective as well, just to give it that bit of Spiderverse flavor. And then I'm using a bunch of different brushes just to bring those pipes and the wires to life. I also should probably mention that most of the painting that you see here, I'm keeping my opacity turned off and my pen pressure turned off in Photoshop, apart from things like gradients or a slight reflection or a little bit of bounce light. The reason that I do that is, again, to keep everything nice and graphic, and using the pen tool you can create very, very clean shapes too. So it's really just a combination of using the lasso tool, the rectangular marquee tool, and even your own brush, just to create nice clean shapes and then to paint on top of them. Again, I'm staying mostly zoomed out to not get lost in the details here. You can start to see that after a while it just becomes the same couple of processes each time in order to paint things. Lasso tool, shapes, perspective, color. It's really just the same thing again and again. And so this window over here, I didn't create it in my flat texture at the beginning, but I am painting it in now as well. And then again, just to illustrate that you don't have to have everything perfect on the first go. For me too, I also like to keep my layers fairly clean, so as you'll see me going throughout this painting process, I like to group everything together, give it a color just so I know roughly where everything is. If you press V on your keyboard in Photoshop, it brings up the direct selection tool, and if you click on any point in your illustration, it's going to show you exactly what that layer is too. So that's a really, really handy tip. When I'm working on the rubbish as well, I'm again not zooming in, I'm not painting in every single wrapper or newspaper or clipping that I see. I'm using a combination of the lasso tool and a few different custom shapes to just get the essence or the visual noise of rubbish. But they're very, very simple, and they're only like one color and shape as well that you can see at the bottom. When I'm creating the graffiti, I'm using a softer airbrush here just to get that nice sort of dispersion of color. I'm keeping the brush fairly small and then just sort of drawing everything in. At this point too, I want to mention that the graffiti layer sits underneath the brick layer, the custom shaped brick layer that we have. And I am going ahead and painting everything because I consider it as part of the texture. And what I'll do is, after that's done, I'll go back on top of the brick layer, make a clipping mask, and then paint in some of the shadows of where the bricks are. So now we're just going to have some fun and create this flat bit of graffiti here, and I'm painting and designing this completely flat, again because perspective is very, very difficult to deal with as you're designing something. So the rule of thumb is to create it flat, make it a texture, and then just, again, the exact same thing, warping it into perspective. I am creating a mask over this layer as well, just to paint out some of the graffiti. I noticed in my reference that the graffiti was faded, and so this really helps to create a non-destructive way of bringing in some of those bricks and fading out that graffiti. And again, in this side, I just want to show you a different way of creating graffiti. Because this building is pretty flat, it doesn't really matter too much, but you can either create it as a flat, smart object or paint directly on. Again, it's really up to you, but I just wanted to show you both methods here. When it comes to things like creating signs as well, such as like no stopping, street signs, things of that nature, it's just the exact same way that I approach graffiti. So creating it flat, warping it in perspective, and then putting all of my details after as well. So attention, hello, you are cool. Now I'm putting in some of the finishing touches, so going back and adding in more details to this pipe here, little bits and pieces of texture, and then now I'm moving on to the car. So you can see that from that initial shape that we created right at the beginning of this painting, I'm staying mostly locked within that, and we're just referring to my reference. Now I'm creating an ellipse that you can see here. This is something that we did in part 2 of the series, and then just moving it in perspective to get that nice, clean ellipse shape for the tire. I'm staying mostly zoomed out at this part. Again, I don't want to get caught up in any details, but I'm just sort of communicating the materials here of this car being reflective. So I'm just paying attention to where the highlights are, where I want most of my shadows, and then just using the lasso tool to create that nice clean edges that you see. At this point, I'm looking at the image and I'm feeling pretty happy with everything. I'm also going in now with an airbrush and changing my layer adjustment style to color dodge, and then just painting in some of that bounce lighting to really reinforce the sunlight coming through. I'm going through with a couple of extra bits and pieces of detail, so using in some rake brushes, using in brushes that have color dynamics switched on, also drawing floating lines over everything, which is again very common in Spider-Verse, and just essentially having fun with the image over here. So yeah, there you go, that brings it to the end of the time lapse. Okay everybody, that is going to wrap up this series here of how to paint graphic environments in Photoshop. If I went a little bit too fast in this video here, or if there's anything that you don't understand, please let me know in the comments down below and I'll get back to you. The aim of this time lapse here, I hope the difficulty spike wasn't too abrupt, just from going from using the tools to essentially painting an entire environment. But the main point of this series is to teach you the tools of how I approach certain things. Once again, how to tackle things like bricks and windows and all of this extra crazy detail that you get in urban environments. So I'm showing that you can create it very, very simply, warp it into perspective, do all of the extra details that you need to do, and keep things very, very straightforward. As always, you can check out my Gumroad for all of the supplementary material that I'll be providing for this series here, as well as this Photoshop file that you can purchase and have a look through at my layers and just noodle around as well. I really do appreciate the support. It's been a blast making this series here. And until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.